Hi, I'm William Stewart. Welcome back to our verse by verse study on the book of Second Timothy. Wow, what a great study this is. A book that tells us so much about how to minister and serve to other people. Written by the Apostle Paul to his disciple Timothy, who headed the church at Ephesus probably sometime in the early 60s. And this may have been the last book of Paul's writing career of which we know. Interesting, we know quite a bit about Ephesus in biblical history, excuse me, in the New Testament, probably more than any other city, from the Paul's visits in the second and third missionary journeys, where he spent a long time building the church there, to the book of Ephesus, where we learn about so much about the Christian walk and theology, and a time where actually in this book, not a lot of issues seem to exist in the church itself. But by the time Paul writes First and Second Timothy, there seem to be some pressures inside the church and perhaps outside the church that was really weighing Timothy down. And as you know from our other videos in this book, that he has tried to encourage him with his own commitment, the truth of the doctrine and the gospel, and Timothy's own long commitment, as well as that of his family that came before him. So we're in, ultimately, we know from the last letter concerning Ephesus that many people don't think about in the book of Revelation, chapter 2, the final 7 letters to the churches in Revelation from Christ, that they continue to have problems in keeping Christ number one. And interesting, after this, Ephesus, as important as a trading town on the coast of Asia Minor that it was, seems to fade from history. And was it associated with the issues of the church, and actually Christ threatened to remove their lampstand, or perhaps their power and vitality they had as a church, or even the institution of the church itself, if they did not return to their first love, which probably meant him himself and just were not based in works. So a very interesting story where Ephesus seems to struggle, where other towns around them, and of course Christianity in general, thrived in the second half of the Roman Empire in their history. But in the meantime, we'll learn a lot from Ephesus and Paul's instruction to the church and to Timothy. We're in verses 20 and 21, and Paul is emphasizing to the Christians in Ephesus and to Timothy specifically to stay the course and to stay away from sin and to stay away from people like Teleios and Hymenaeus, which were just mentioned several verses ago, who had bad doctrine and were causing people to stumble. So he uses an illustration in verse 20, but in a great house there are not only vessels of gold and silver, otherwise vessels you like to have around and are very useful, but also of wood and earth. Perhaps those that are not as useful and are more meant to decay and are certainly not beautiful in most cases. Some to honor then, and some to dishonor. And so after this illustration in 21, he clarifies what it means. If a man therefore purges himself, and it's interesting, this word here, the Greeks, to give nuance to their meaning at the time of biblical Greek, they would add prepositions, and sometimes two prepositions. And here are two: ek, out of, and kata, down, iro, which is the main verb, away from, take away. So take away down, throw it down away from you and get it out. Ek kata iro, really clean yourself out of these things, meaning vessels of dishonor, sin. He shall be a vessel, back to the verse, of honor, something that whose life is useful and honorable to God one day when we stand before him at the judgment seat, not in relationship to our salvation, but our works. 1 Corinthians 3. We will be honored because the gold and silver will be, though everything will be burned away except the gold and silver, that remains is honorable to God, and shows our that the works that we did, which are gold and silver, were good and pure. Sanctified, this verse then says. Otherwise, the word here means set apart. We set ourselves apart by the power of the Spirit through the regeneration that we have. Being a new person, we have the power to do this to serve God for the master's use. As it says in Romans 6, because of this regeneration, we can serve him, and we are to not sin. We have the power not to sin and serve God, and thus being prepared to do every good work. Great mindset. God's given us the capacity through the Spirit and regeneration to serve him. And thus he implores the Ephesians and Timothy to do this, to be a vessel that's useful to God. All right, very good. Thanks for joining me. We'll continue on this in this very powerful chapter next time. I'm glad you're here today, and I hope you'll join me in the next video as well. Goodbye for now.